Hello and welcome to the NBA Outlet Preview Series presented by OTGBasketball.com. Make sure you follow OTG on Twitter at OTG Basketball. Also hit that subscribe button. I'm your host, Nick Fay. With me, two OTG greats, Christian, Jac Manuell. What's up, fellas?
I'm a rocket man.
You stole my line.
Mine's like Jay.
Well, thanks for having us, Nick. Glad to be a part of it.
Shout out to Jay. He does a ton for OTG behind the scenes. I want to make sure he gets his proper recognition. But let's talk Rockets, like Jack said. You know, they're coming number 4 to our rankings. Before we talk about the game, let's talk about last season.
So it was the re-emergence and reinvention of Mike D'Antoni. The partnership with James Harden, moving him to the point, worked wonders for Houston. Led the team to 55 wins, the number 2 offense in the league, jacking up, a massive 43s a game, otherworldly numbers. They ended up flaming out in the playoffs to the Spurs, even though they were favored. They were favorites going into that series. It was a bit of a shame, but I'm sure that's going to serve as motivation for Harden, Paul, and the rest of the crew out there in Houston going into the new season.
Yeah, I thought, your point on D'Antoni is well taken. I think we're starting to see the his style that he brought with sort of 8 seconds or less sort of run the NBA now, right? I mean,
yeah,
a decade ago we were thinking, oh, there's no way you can win a championship with that style. Coming to find out, that's the style that the Golden State Warriors are winning championships with. Cleveland sort of adopted, to a certain extent, and that's how the NBA is playing now. You made a reference to the number of threes that are going up. That's filtering all the way down to high school kids just jacking them up, from way beyond where they should be shooting them. So, D'Antoni is sort of the father of the style, right? And so, I didn't come with the stats, so I brought some corny movie references. There's the line in Demolition Man where Sylvester Stallone says, send the maniac to catch one, right? So I think D'Antoni's taking the approach of, we're not going to lock up KD and Steph Curry and Draymond and the Golden State Warriors, but we'll get in a shootout with them and we'll just see what's what at the end of the day. So I think the Rockets are taking that approach, and you saw that last year in their style, shooting threes, getting back, sort of the analytics of basketball on full display for the Rockets last year.
Yeah, and they're a ton of fun to watch. Like you said, D'Antoni coming to Houston, allowing Harden to be him, and that whole offense, Daniel Morey has done a great job of getting them good pieces around. And it just felt like last year a little bit that like James Harden's season was overlooked because we had Russell Westbrook average a triple-double. Like James Harden historically put up one of the best offensive seasons that we've probably ever seen in the NBA, and it feels like nobody really talked about it because we had Westbrook average a triple-double.
Yeah, it was so we mentioned it a bit on the OKC pod. The fact that his season got lost in the wings. 29 points, 8 rebounds, 11.2 assists. He averaged more assists than Russell Westbrook. He only lost to him, I guess, in the points and the rebounds. So you could say that. I mean, you could certainly have made the argument for Harden winning the MVP, and I mean he's missed out on 2 now for the past 2 years. So I doubt he's going to win this year's one with the addition of Chris Paul, but he certainly had a season for the ages.
And that was a clash of styles, right? I mean, it's pretty amazing to watch last year's MVP race because you had Westbrook on a tear, and a shout out to the OKC preview pod the other day, guys, and put up historical numbers and was sort of chasing this, Oscar Robertson's triple-double record, and that's sort of the old NBA math, right? Where you just like counting and people getting double digits of things, right? So yeah, everyone's fascinated. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely right. And then you have that juxtaposed against James Harden, his sort of analytical, game and a lot of things that you measure with sort of the new math of the NBA that's, really championed by Daryl Morey. I mean, Morey sent out his series of tweets and comments and articles about, hey, if you actually look at the numbers, what James Harden is doing for his team, compared to Russell Westbrook and Morey's run, it was not even close in terms of the MVP race. So, it was a historical season in Harden's own right. And I always say, by no stretch of the imagination am I saying that James Harden is better than Steve Nash. But what I will say in terms of scoring, I think D'Antoni looked and said, hey, as great as Steve was running this offense, imagine if I had a legitimate threat running the point that is capable of going off for 40, 50 points if he needs to and averaging 30 points a game. So it's sort of 8 seconds or less 2.0 with Harden, running this offense.
Yeah, and that's a great point. They put James Harden at Steve Nash role, and I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not trying to make predictions here, but I think James Harden could have a better career just based off of if he can keep getting better and what he does in the postseason, but that's for another day. What were your thoughts on, the Rockets' defense? Like, why do you think they struggled so much defensively? Was it the system, or do you think it was somewhat lack of talent on the defensive side of the ball?
Look, I don't think they actually really did struggle that. I think much has been made of their defensive struggles, Nick, but doing a little bit of research on where they landed in terms of rankings and their defensive rating, funnily enough, was just in that lower half at finishing 17th. So, they weren't the Denver Nuggets by any stretch of the imagination, finishing 27th in that bottom five. I think, you've still got a Trevor Ariza there, Patrick Beverley. Those are two guys that certainly were defensive stalwarts. I think Beverley made one of the all-defense teams. You add in now, the guys that they picked up in the offseason in Tucker and Bar Mute. CP3 is probably the best defensive guard that we've got in the NBA right now. So I think they've sort of filled the gap a little bit with what they've done. But last year, I think, because their offense was so otherworldly and so transformational in terms of the standard that they set with the threes and everything that Jay was mentioning with the 8 seconds or less. I think that sort of overshadowed actually that they weren't that bad.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think it's sort of easy sort of basketball Twitter fodder to say, oh, well, the Rockets are so bad on defense and, Harden's this turnstile. No one's going to mistake him for Ron Artest in his prime, right, on the defensive end. I agree, Jack. I think they weren't bad, and I appreciate the nugget shade there that you had in your comment earlier.
I couldn't help but not.
Just a comparison, just to give people, all the listeners, a gauge of how bad the Rockets aren't on defense. Hey, they could be the Nuggets.
They could be the Nuggets, exactly.
They could be the Nuggets. So, I think much was made of their defensive prowess or lack thereof, and I mean, quite frankly, that's always been D'Antoni's team. I mean, they tried, even in his Phoenix days, they'd go hard on defense for, a practice or two, but then they just kind of revert back to what they do best, which is an offensive juggernaut. And I mean, even in those great Phoenix teams, I mean, you had, prime Sean Marion and Raja Bell, but rest of the team, they weren't known for their defensive prowess. So last year's team, they had a few junkyard dogs out there. Patrick Beverley, who's now in the Clippers, Trevor Ariza, who's still, I think, a pretty legit wing defender. And what's interesting, I'm sure we'll probably get to this, but what's interesting with the additions they've made, and we sort of referenced with Paul and PJ Tucker and Baumute coming from the Clippers, they actually improved on defense. I think they have the personnel anyway to improve on defense, to have wings that you can throw at the Warriors. You just need guys that can come out and defend Klay Thompson, that can come out and defend Kevin Durant. And you got guys sort of, the quote unquote 3-and-D guys that can come out, shoot 3-pointers and defend on the wing. So they actually did a pretty good job of improving that part of the roster, I thought.
Yeah, they definitely did a great job taking an improvement in that area. I mean, I think 18, like you guys said, isn't terrible, but I still think if you want to be, a championship team, you probably need to get in the top half. But like you said, they made some additions. But leading to my next point, what do you think was the reason for the letdown against the Spurs? Do you think it was D'Antoni getting outcoached? Do you think it was James Harden's play? Do you think it was the bench? Do you think it was the role players? What was the reason they weren't able to move on in the playoffs?
I think it's a combination of the things you mentioned there, Nick. I funnily enough, took a screenshot from Basketball Reference of James Harden's playoffs. Had some decent numbers early on, but he really did flame out. And that Game 6 was just the icing on the cake. A plus-minus of -28. His free throw percentage, which is normally great, he could barely get to the line only 6 times. He was 18% from the field. This is a guy who's known to be a legit shooter, legit scorer. He couldn't make his teammates better. He only took 11 shots as well. It's not like he made 5 of 11 or 6 of 11. He made 2 of 11 shots. So it's not like he went down, sort of like how John Wall did in that game 7 against the Celtics. He went down, took like 20 shots. So he wasn't going to go die wondering. Whereas James Harden just literally looked like he ran out of gas. He didn't have any help. That Manu Ginobili block was just sort of symptomatic of the lack of energy. You can't get blocked by a 39-year-old Manu Ginobili from behind. Like, seriously, come on.
That hurt to watch. Like,
it did. It literally did. But yeah, he ran out of gas.
I don't know if that's a compliment to Ginobili or if that's shade. I don't.
It's a bit of both. A bit for column A.
Bit of both. Right. I think I think from the physical, I think his body, it just took a toll, right? And I think that's one of the advantages of having Paul on the team this year is that there are just so many different lineups that they can try, and Harden to get a little more rest, I think, for a long playoff run. Yeah, I just think he hit a wall physically, and I think the only other person, ironically, that hit a bigger wall than him in the playoffs was Russell Westbrook, and we saw how that series turned out in round one. Excuse me. And that was a comment that a lot of folks had when they traded for Paul. It's like, oh, how are they going to play together? Besides crunch time, I mean, I think for a majority of the game, D'Antoni's probably thinking, well, I have essentially two units, one where Harden's running the point for one and Paul's running the point for another. Get these both these guys a significant rest throughout the year. And then I think sort of the hero narrative of the NBA, right? I mean, with the exception of I think who made Magic Johnson, who came to the league with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Larry Bird, who had a great team as well. Most of the times when guys make that climb, up the ladder, sort of in their career and with their teams ascending, sometimes it takes time, And Harden went from, sort of low key bickering with Dwight Howard over the last few years, and being with the Kardashians, whatever that entails, to to sort of having this come to Jesus moment last year and saying, well, I'm doing different things now. I'm ready to lead the team, and that maturation process. I mean, he's still out with Travis Scott, so he's still growing up, right? So, but it all doesn't happen in a year, right? It all doesn't happen. I mean, when Jordan finally took that mantle and ascended and got past the Pistons, sometimes it takes time. I mean, and that's more of a heart than a head argument, right? That's not really anything that we can quantify with the stats necessarily, but that's just sort of how basketball works, with rare exception. That when someone takes that mantle and that superstar goes from all-star to superstar to all-timer, it happens in stages. And I think for Harden, those stages will be getting past the Spurs and on his vision quest against the Warriors one day. I mean, it's all very romantic for a basketball pod, but I think that's just how this thing works, right? That's just how it happens.
No, I agree. I think Harden hit a different level last year, and now he needs to move on to that level, and he can take a step as a leader. And like you mentioned, I think Chris Paul on the court is going to help him in the whole Rockets thing. But I think in terms of leadership, he could also help the load too, because we know Harden's not really the type to get after everybody, but Chris Paul's not going to be scared to get up in your face and tell you, you missed that assignment. I want you to be here. So I think it'll be a nice little balance, like a yin and a yang, kind of like what we talked about on the New Orleans pod, like Anthony Davis, DeMarcus Cousins. You could see a little bit of a balance like that.
Sure, absolutely.
I was going to just mention while we're on James Harden, the comments today from his former coach, Kevin McHale, saying that he's not a leader. Do you guys agree with that, disagree with that, or do you think that it's all sort of smoke and water? Like it should be taken with a grain of salt. I thought it was significant if it was coming from a lesser known sort of personality like a Chuck or a Kenny or someone like that. But this came from a former coach of his.
Right. It's weird. It's hard to distinguish. I thought that was odd in the sense that, or ironic, I guess, at the very least. I think I give it more weight because it's the guy that coached Harden. And I think just knowing Kevin McHale, and I think he was, I think it was a good relationship with Morey, but I think McHale was still kind of a quote unquote old school basketball coach. So I think when he had Dwight Howard on the roster, for instance, I think would have loved to go more through Dwight, and Morey sort of the new school, we're either shooting a three or we're dunking it, right, kind of thing. So I think not a lot, but a little bit of that's just a little bit of sour grapes from how things ended in Houston. But I think Kevin's great on TV and a great analyst. So I take his comments with the due weight. But it's also ironic too, because McHale, I think, fits perfectly into this mold. That I think McHale was a great player, but you read anything about Kevin McHale in those days with the Celtics, I mean, he's a pretty laid back guy. He was not the leader. You know what I mean? He's an excellent player, Hall of Fame player, but it doesn't always have to hold that your best player is this leader, this rah-rah guy. We're just talking about Chris Paul, and that's definitely, Chris Paul's role. He's just that guy, but not everybody's like that on a basketball team or on any team, quite frankly. But so I thought so I guess to sum it up, I think McHale might be right, but my response to that is, so what? Your best player doesn't necessarily have to be this leader guy. I think we saw Paul George last year in Indiana try to force that with, I got to take the last shot, and sort of bring out this Mamba mentality. Shout out to Mamba. Uh, but uh, but not everybody's like that, and sometimes that's just not everybody's personality. And I think you can be a leader without being this guy barking and chewing everybody out on the sidelines and I got to take the last shot. I mean, I don't know. I think you're dealing with grown men, and that just seems a little childish to me.
Yeah, very fair point.
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, I agree with everything you said, Jay. And I think it kind of touched on the point you mentioned earlier. Like Harden can still he's getting older. He's maturing into his role. I think he can take another step in that, and having Chris Paul is going to help. But what was the biggest highlight of the Rocket season last year?
Look, I'm just giving it to James Harden. He not only
Right.
I've got to give it to him. I mean, we've given him. I mean, we didn't give him shit. It was his former coach that did it. So I think it ties in nice. It's a nice segue that we got there. But he's being joined by a point guard now, but he was a point guard last season. He made not only himself better, and like sort of as Jay was mentioning, took that next step in terms of going from star to superstar. But he also made his teammates better. And I think a lot of credit does have to go to D'Antoni, creating the system around him and sort of both of them having that trust in each other. Because, it's difficult for a shooting guard to go to a point guard,
Sure.
run an offense, do so. It's a completely different position. And I'm sure both of you guys probably are more well-versed than me when it comes to that. But the fact that they could develop that so early on, it set the standard and for the rest of the season. And I guess it showed that the relationship between D'Antoni and Harden was miles apart from what McHale and Harden had, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say the moment for me, I believe Little B lifted the base god curse, so I thought that was significant. I think that more than anything has them poised for success for years to come. No, I mean I think the story's Harden, and I think it's D'Antoni. It's just great to see, because really D'Antoni just took it on the chin for years for the way he played ball, right? And now that is the style. I mean, even just the math. I mean, just the way we think about, and this is sort of getting to like Nobel Prize territory for D'Antoni, but the way we think about, basketball, and there's days where, Patrick Ewing would try to shoot over David Robinson, and somehow we thought that was a better shot than a wide open, uncontested, 20-foot jump shot. And that's all, a lot of it's tied back to D'Antoni. And man, he just took it on the chin for years, not because the system was bad, it was because, well, hell, they were playing the Spurs, and the Spurs happened to have Tim Duncan, who's an all-timer, and they were playing the Mavericks, who were really good at times, and they're playing Kobe. You know what I mean? So, it wasn't the system. They were just run up against better players. It's with the analytics guys. This is a sidetrack, but guys will say, "Well, Jordan statistically was the best player." It's like, no crap. He's like the best ever. Yes, analytically speaking, he was awesome. Yes, thank you, basketball nerd guy. But no, back to the point. I'm just happy to see D'Antoni, sort of find his footing, and for basketball, him to still be around, for basketball to come around and really embrace his style of play. And ironically, there's a monster out west that he's got to try to conquer, who is, taking his style to another level. But yeah, the relationship with he and Harden, and just seeing D'Antoni get another crack at it, I think are some big stories from last year for me.
Yeah, and you mentioned, D'Antoni having to go up against great teams, and now he has to deal with the Warriors. So, like, he's going to have a great season, and there's still a chance that he's still going to lose in the playoffs.
Prime Warriors, by the way, who are like giving money back in contract years. So,
but for me, I got to go with James Harden. He accounted for 4,554 points last season. I think that's more than any other player ever has in one season. That's in terms of, scoring and assisting. And that's like, Jack, you hit on it earlier. One of my favorite things about Harden is I think that he makes his teammates better. And that's why I was like really big on Harden the MVP race. Obviously, it was hard to deny Westbrook after the triple-double thing. But I mean, I had Harden right there all the way to the end. So
why do you guys think, sorry, this is off schedule a little bit, but why do you guys think this didn't work with Dwight Howard and James Harden? Do you think it's just oil and water? Do you think it's just bad timing? Because I wonder how that team how everything would have shaken out had they won that series, where Dame hits the shot and, Portland goes on and they go home. Because I thought Howard had monster numbers for the Rockets. But what do you guys take on that?
Yeah, look, I'll probably go with the fact that he was I read the SI article where he was talking to Lee Jenkins, and Dwight Howard said he had to communicate better, and he just wasn't a great communicator. And I think both of them on that end, and we spoke about their leadership style, they just don't have that capacity to sort of be the guy and sort of call them out like a Russell Westbrook, like a Kobe Bryant, like a Michael Jordan. They didn't have the communication skills. They weren't, being led by a coach who can sort of facilitate that partnership. And I think as well, a sort of big two when you got like an old school guy in Dwight Howard. That was probably the last great sort of season we saw from Dwight Howard. Not that I'm saying he's not going to have a decent season with Charlotte this year, but I think that it was both personality clash, but then it's also game clash. I don't think they could really develop that on-court chemistry either. And I mean, you could compare them to like the timing as well. Like, you're coming up against an all-time Warriors team when, everyone's going to fade into the blackness, but, there's still those great teams that we remember, like the Phoenix Suns, Mike D'Antoni's Phoenix Suns and stuff. I think a lot of it is just combined things that you've mentioned, Jay. A little bit from column A, a little bit from column B.
Yeah, I think it's the personalities, and like I didn't want to throw Dwight shade today, but I think you have to look at Dwight, and the fact that he was with the Lakers, he was with the Rockets, he's with the Hawks for one season. They're trying to salary dump him already. I think that says a lot about him. And I think, not necessarily all his personality and that he's clashing with everybody, but I think on the court sometimes he thinks that he's better than who he is at this point in his career.
Right.
So
yeah, no, I just remember being excited when they signed him, and then I looked back and was like, oh, well, that was.
It's always like what could have been with Dwight. It's always like, if he didn't have that back injury, or if he fit better with Harden, like what would have happened? So I think it's just like a lot of what could have been, and he's just never been the same from that Orlando guy. But talking disappointments, what was the biggest? What's the biggest disappointment for the Rockets last season?
Look, we've touched on it. I'm going with that Game 6 Spurs. It all just fell apart. They were destroyed by the San Antonio Spurs, and I think we mentioned briefly the fact that D'Antoni throughout the playoffs didn't really have the depth that the Rockets do now. We didn't see a lot of Sam Dekker, one of Corey's guys, very often. And he sort of stuck to those sort of 7-8 man rotations, which led to the downfall of Harden and his teammates, because, his teammates don't make those shots, then it doesn't give Harden that sort of energy. It doesn't, he doesn't get those assist numbers. It doesn't create those open lanes for him to sort of get to the line as well. So I think it was a culmination of that. And I think that Game 6 was sort of a low point for them, and there were a lot of questions over Harden over the preseason, over the off season, due to that last game. But I think that they're all washing away now with this flashy new point guard that they've got.
Yeah, I think as much praise as I've used on this pod to heap on D'Antoni, I think it's a fair criticism with last year, and I think it's starting to be a bit of his track record in the sense of, in terms of. In-game or in-series adjustments, right? I mean, I think we brought up the point about, was he outcoached against Popovich, who's certainly one of the best to ever do it. But, there's a pretty extensive record, I would argue, with D'Antoni not really making in-series adjustments and game adjustments. And, to your point, Jack, with the shrinking the bench, which everyone does in the playoffs, right? The rotation's just shorter and shorter. But at the same time, I think you can argue, and I think Rockets fans could argue, that D'Antoni didn't make the adjustments when they needed to be made. I don't know which levers those are to push. I mean, some coaches are just really good at that. I mean, for all the zen that Phil Jackson talked about, he was actually really good at making in-game adjustments, to making in-series adjustments. Larry Brown's another all-timer in terms of doing that. And D'Antoni's had his struggles with that, going back to his Phoenix days. So I think that series is a disappointment, but that's also something I think that, if you're playing, I guess, devil's advocate for the Rockets and how successful they could be, it's not just meshing the styles of Chris Paul and James Harden, but it's also D'Antoni. What kind of adjustments can he make in series? What can he do to counterpunch the Spurs or the Warriors or whatever series they're in? So I think it's a fair criticism, and I think that's something that, like I said, stems back to his Phoenix days.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, Jay. You know, the fact that he wasn't able to adjust, especially after Nene went down, it just felt like that sometimes you looked at him and he just looked like he was confused and he didn't know what to do. Like he just had no idea about, how he could kind of win this. And I felt like Popovich was out coaching him. And just to lose
Hmm.
the way they did, I mean, I love James Harden. I love the Rockets. They're like a team that I like to watch a lot. So I'm not trying to hate on them, but they just kind of completely choked in the series against the Spurs, and I wanted them to win, and they probably should have won that series. Saying what happened to the Spurs injury wise, and they were the
Hmm.
more talented team probably, and they didn't walk away with a W. So I think as a Rockets fan, if I was a Rockets fan, I would be pretty disappointed in that. And just the fact from an NBA fan, James Harden not playing his best game when it matters the most, that always kind of sucks. You never want to see a big time player just choke like that.
They got rooked. They got
Yeah,
rooked. That's what happened.
yeah. I
Shout out to
remember
Memphis,
being
baby.
I remember being so hyped after they beat OKC because they look good in that series. And next thing you know, against the Spurs, it's like what happened? It's like night and day. But Popovich can do that to a lot of teams.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no, and if Pop gets the best of you, that I mean, join the club, right? But to your point, Nick, you said he's kind of looking at the bench and trying to figure out what to do. I just had this picture of when you're hungry and you go to the fridge and there's
Yes,
nothing in the fridge, then you're like, ah, dang, all right, I got to figure out what I'm gonna do. And then you go back to the fridge and it looks like same fridge, bro, same thing 20 minutes ago. It's like you get shots of D'Antoni, he's kind of looking down there, and he's looking at Corey favorite, Sam Decker, and he's like, I don't know, we'll see. And it's like you gotta try something, man. Something's got to work. That's one thing you give credit to Don Nelson, former Mavs coach. He would try stuff. You know what I mean? Some of it was just crazy, but Don's like, all right, let's try that. Sure, why not? Manute Bowl at point. Let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And I'm not saying that D'Antoni should get that careless or reckless with his coaching moves in the playoffs of all places, but you got to pull some triggers, man. You got to pull some levers and see what works. And sometimes you catch lightning in a bottle. I mean, that's the Draymond Green story, right? I mean, if
yeah.
Kerr doesn't shuffle him out there, we don't know that Draymond Green's a top 5 player in the league and capable of doing all these things until Kerr gives him a shot and he's out there doing what he does best.
Yeah, and I think, coaching is a really interesting point about D'Antoni, especially with this season with the new pieces they have. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's talk about this ranking. Rockets coming in number 4. Our writers came up with these rankings. This is a top 5 team right here. How do you feel about the number 4 ranking? Too high, too low, fair?
I reckon our crew's got it right on the money. I reckon they probably could be number 3. But in the many pods that I've done with you, Nick, I've discussed about the team's variability between their ceiling and their basement. And I think this Rocket team is probably one of the highest basements, which means they can't really go that low. When you look where they finished last year, they were top 3 seed in the West. So I think 4, 3. I can't see them any lower than 5 or 6. So I think we're a pretty smart bunch at OTG. So I think we got it on the money here.
Yeah, and I agree. The crew wouldn't steer us wrong. I think 4 is fair. I could make the argument for as high as 2. I think.
I think so too.
I think if you do this parlor game here, right? If we drop the Rockets in the East, they're probably number 1 seed, easily, or arguably. Easily is a little too much. That's a little sports radio guy there. But yeah, I think 4 is fair. I mean, I could see argument, and to Jack's point, I wouldn't move them much more than that. If it, I wouldn't slide them down much lower than that. I mean, if it starts getting, past 6, quite frankly, I'd start to question it. But yeah, I think 4 is fair.
Yeah, I think 4 is pretty fair. But like you said, Jay, I could see the argument for number 2. And I probably would like to put them at 3. I think at this point, with the depth they've added and the pieces they have, they're probably a little better than the Spurs. I guess going into the season, you always want to give the Spurs a little respect. But by the end of the year, I think they could easily be the second best team in the NBA.
And see, I'm tired of this. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm tired of the Spurs and the Patriots getting this treatment, right? Like the Spurs are higher because of something Tim Duncan did in 2009 or 2007. And, I listened to NBA radio today on Sirius XM, and it was shout out to the plug there if they're listening. Anybody serious? We can move this globally if you guys would like. But and they're talking about, the Spurs are figured out. But LaMarcus Aldridge is unhappy. He's not fitting there. I mean, the legitimate piece to me that anybody would want is obviously Kawhi Leonard. I mean, just the sort of Spurs benefit of the doubt. It's like, well, if you go roster to roster, man to man, there's nobody I think that would objectively say that the Spurs have more talent than the Rockets. But it's just sort of this, New England Patriots. Oh, they figured it out, and they're the Spurs. Bullpucky. Sorry, that just drives me nuts. People do that without any sort of objective measure other than, well, it's the Spurs, and they do it. It's like, well, yeah, but before 2014, when's the last time they won a title? I know that was like 2007, which is pretty good. There are a lot of teams that would take that gap of time between titles. But I mean, just the curve that they get just for being the Spurs drives me nuts. Sorry, that was a rant that had nothing to do with
That is perfectly fine. I definitely can see that. But I would probably someone could probably make the argument, well, they have Pop and they have an incredible front office, and they always
But
do
none of
this
those guys
random
are
thing.
playing though.
Well, what I was going to say is they always have this random thing where they'll just kind of whip this international player out of nowhere and he'll be a nice piece on their bench. I think they do a good job with player development too, so that's kind of why they might get a little bit extra. But I agree. I think the fact that, anytime you win consistently like they had, actually, Jack and I were talking about this before. I think 20 seasons, in the playoffs or something like that, people are just going to kind of always do that. But I agree. I think, if you looked at it just roster and you don't see anything, I can't say, like, how can you see that the Spurs are a better team than the Rockets on paper?
You can't.
Yeah. So, but
That's all I had. Sorry, I didn't mean I'll get off my soapbox now.
no, it's all good.
It drives me nuts.
Especially the Patriots this year. I know it's not an NFL pod, but they have not looked good at all. So, but that's
right. But people are still like, well, but what's Belichick thinking? It's like nothing. He's trying to win the game like everybody else. He's not. Sometimes it's not that deep. So sometimes, and to your point about front offices generally, it's like, shout out to them for getting it right. And shame on you if your favorite team is in the AFC East and not the Patriots. Like, they've been running roughshod on your league for 15 years, and your team has done squat. You know what I mean? Like, I'd be pissed if I was a Jets fan or Bills fan. It's like, what have we been doing for the last 15 years? I don't know. That's
Nothing.
crazy to me too. Right, exactly. So, anyways.
But moving on to the Rockets offseason, let's talk additions. Draft-wise, no first-round pick, but they did have a second-round pick. They drafted Isaiah Hartstein. I believe he's playing overseas, raw prospect. Moving forward, he does have some potential, but, it's always kind of hit or miss with these overseas guys.
Yeah, I think because they're quite stacked at that 5 position as well. You mentioned, he's quite raw, Nick. He's athletic enough, he's mobile enough, got a decent enough jumper. But, one of those draft and stash guys that could see some time next year, sort of like, how we're seeing with Chetty Osman and maybe even Ante Zizic. Give him a year in Europe, and who knows what could happen. He could be another piece to add to D'Antoni's system, but I don't think we'll be seeing much of him.
Yeah, I think the Daryl Morey school of team building is stars with a capital S. Morey says, give me as many stars as possible. It takes stars to win in this game. His protege took that and, invented the process in Philadelphia and cost him his job. But it turns out he might be right when it's all said and done with Sam Hinkie. But Morey is a star guy. And I say that to say, I think when Morey drafts, unless someone is a home run hitter and, if he's drafting international players, I think he's looking for the next Dirk or the next Manu, a guy he can stash and bring over. Otherwise, I think he views the draft as assets. I think he views them as guys you can, put in a nice bow, package, and send over to a team to get their superstar, to get the Paul Georges and the Chris Pauls of the world. Daryl Morey has, unless I'm misreading everything he said since he's been general manager, it's all about stars on a team. I think Morey thinks you need 3. He'll try to do what you can with 2, but 3 is the number that he's shooting for in a starting lineup. So I think the Rockets draft prospects, to me, for the foreseeable future, will be, drafting these kids, getting them on nice contracts, or these, potential picks that you can package up and gift wrap, sort of a la the Celtics, and really get a superstar on your roster. So in terms of, we're talking about player development with the Spurs. I don't think that's on the Rockets' radar anytime soon, quite frankly, unless a guy is just a bona fide stud. I think these are assets, commodities for which Morey can use to trade guys. So, I think most draft picks in the future for the Rockets will be, guys we can ship off and get a superstar in return, is my thought.
Well, you mentioned adding superstars, and you know what they did this offseason? They traded half of their roster for Chris Paul, and they're able to add a superstar. But in terms of who they really traded big name wise, Sam Decker, Patrick Beverly, Lou Williams, DeAndre Liggins, Montrezl Harrell, a few other throw-ins in terms of salary money. But they added, in my opinion, still a top 5 point guard in Chris Paul. What are your thoughts on him? And were you surprised that he ended up in Houston?
Very surprised. I mean, all the trades that happened this offseason, we didn't really predict them happening. No one predicted Kyrie and Boston. There was the talk of New York and there was the talk of Phoenix. They were all big surprises. And as much as I didn't expect CP3 to re-sign, I did expect him. The Rockets were out of nowhere. But what he brings with him is I've written a few articles, obviously, about him and the sort of presence that he had on the Clippers and what he's going to bring to the Rockets. He's probably the best NBA point guard in terms of all-round skill set, offensive and defensive. Perennially, one of the best on-ball defenders in the league. Great shooter, masterful passer, masterful floor general. I think it's going to be interesting, and I'm sure it's going to work fine, as we've seen already in a couple of the preseason games. Him taking away those mid-range sort of shots and taking that step back, or instead driving into the lane, because D'Antoni's and Murray's for that matter, they don't like those inefficient, those analytic nerds shots that we've been talking about. So I like the fit. You can't not love having two great floor generals. I think NBA TV ran a special where they were saying, I think it might have been Jason Kidd, that the future of the NBA is, you're just going to have playmakers, 5 playmakers. The Warriors have that right now. So I think that's where we're going, and the Houston Rockets have certainly made that step.
I'm sure Jaja will appreciate you calling him a playmaker. I think.
Well, when they sub Zaza off or Sean Livingston, you guys know what I mean. I don't count him in the. He's not even like a player for me. Like he gets a rebound.
He goes from the compliment to the ultimate.
Not even a player for me.
When you think of Zaza Pachulia last season, all you think of is how he injured Kawhi Leonard. That is all we think of in terms of the impact that he had in the NBA last season. Shout out to Zaza. I'm sure he's listening all the way in Atlanta, Georgia right now. Sorry, Georgia, the country. My bad. But yeah, it's. I think in terms of CP3, it's a Murray's. He's with the Sam Presti. He's one of those guys that he somehow fleeces teams, and I mean they gave up in a trade all these pieces. But when you add I think Nick made a point of it in the Clippers podcast. When you add up all those pieces, you sort of get close to a CP3. But I mean, CP3 is still the point guard for a reason.
Sure. No, yeah. I was shocked as well. I mean, when I started hearing Texas, I thought that San Antonio was on the radar for Chris Paul. I never really bought into the Cleveland rumors, but yeah, I think Houston kind of came out of left field for me. I just, I didn't think they had an issue or would be an issue for those two playing together. And I think it was Tom Haberstroh for ESPN wrote an article saying essentially that USA basketball is becoming the new recruiting ground. If you start mapping these things out, a lot of these guys spent time together on the international team. So that, when I saw that article, I was like, it kind of makes sense that Harden is, probably behind the scenes advocating for a trade for Paul. Everything you said, Jack, I agree with it. I think it will be interesting that, the point guard is also sort of the mid-range god. And that is, if you can do nothing else or, anything forbidden in this offense is to pull up from 15 feet. Yeah. And Chris Paul has made a career and a lot of money off being really good at that. So I'm just curious to see, the Monday after a game or whatever, and they're on a road trip and they're back in Toyota Center and Daryl shows up with a spreadsheet and tells them, hey, if you'd have done this, I don't know. So it'd be an interesting conversation. But yeah, I mean, I like the addition of Paul. I'll jump the gun on you here, Nick. I like Tucker. I like these guys just to come in and like I say, just guys that can defend. The Rockets were in the preseason game against OKC the other night, and they put Tucker in at center, a
I
la
like
Donnie
it. I like
Nelson.
it.
And he, God love him, but Tucker is listed at a very generous, I think 6'5", 6'6", and he's definitely shorter than Harden. So just trying different things. But I think now to what we were talking about earlier, but now they have bodies, now they have pieces. Now D'Antoni can get creative in terms of the guys they can throw in the matchups. They can, they can go really long with Trevor Ariza and Capella and get linked on the wings and things like that. Now he's got something in the toolbox that he can go play with and mix and match. You got 82 games to figure out, what your version of the def lineup is, right? What is your lineup you go to that is just a matchup problem for other teams?
Yeah, I think the one thing they did, and you mentioned, you like the additions, is they added players that they can use against Golden State. Obviously, you can play Chris Paul, you can play a PJ Tucker, you can play a Ba Mute. Even some of the other guys they added, Tariq Black isn't bad bench depth. And then they added, I'm going to try to pronounce his name. Jack was helping me before, but Joe K. I don't know how to say that, Jack. That's all you.
Juqui.
Juqui. I mean, I've heard some people are really interested in him in terms of what he can bring and if he can get minutes this year. But one more point on the Chris Paul thing. I believe Chris Paul has not shot a mid-range jumper in preseason yet.
Oh, there you go.
I saw a headline on that, so I don't know what that means. But I do remember D'Antoni saying it was okay if he shot some. Obviously,
he got the blessing. That's good.
Yeah, he got the blessing to shoot the mid-range. Something he's really good at. But in terms of tell me what you like about Tucker and Ba Mute, what they can bring to this team and really help them in the playoffs.
I think it's all about the defensive and lineup versatility. Jay mentioned them playing Tucker at the 5, and his ability to guard 1 through 5. He can switch onto the smaller guys. He can allow CP3 to conserve some defensive energy and and use it on the offensive end, because D'Antoni will probably be asking a lot of him on that end. And Ba Mute was underrated last year from 3. 39%. Yeah, he didn't jack up a lot. 1.5 per game. But he has jacked up 3 or so a few years ago back when he was in Philly. I think he'll be likely to see that increase if he can keep the percentages around the 37 mark, and he'll also be in the corner as well, likely, just sort of kicking out there on the offense. And he was 41% from there last year. So I like what they can do. Ba Mute, I think one of our writers today did a Houston Rockets piece. And I was chatting to him on Twitter about it. And I'm like, you should have mentioned Ba Mute's ability to knock down the 3. Yes, it's in a system now. Out in LA, there was barely any space. You got DeAndre clogging the lanes there, but he's going to have the space with the D'Antoni run and gun 3-and-D system. So I like the versatility that it gives them on the offense and defensive end.
Yeah, I agree. I think since going back to, I call this like the Mario Elie Award, right? The sort of junkyard dog. The Rockets have always sort of had a sort of fan favorite, sort of pit bull on the roster. Going to Mario Elie, Chuck Hayes, and most recently Patrick Beverley. Really hate to see him go, but I think Tucker can fill that role. I mean, he's just a tough as nails guy, and all the silly sports cliches. If I was in a dark alley or a foxhole or wherever else there's danger, I don't know. Pick your metaphor. But Tucker's just a tough dude, and like I say, he can get in there and move people around on the glass, or he can get out on the wing. I think he can guard, like I say, positions 1 through 5. They can get creative in what they want to do with him in terms of matchups. Ba Mute is, like I say, classic 3-and-D guy. Actually shot the ball really, really great from 3. And I Jack, I think he lines up with the system really well and what they're trying to do. And yeah, I just think those guys, in just a nice wing rotation with Ariza, getting guys out that can guard. And I mean, the laser focus, despite what the Rockets might say, once the season starts, is Golden State. How many fouls, how many guys are you going to throw at Kevin Durant? Who are you going to throw at Klay Thompson? How are you going to defend, against Draymond and Steph, obviously? And these are guys that, for all the talk about the offense, I think is actually an upgrade on the defensive end with the additions they made in the Paul trade.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest deal right here is the fact that they have defenders right now. Like you mentioned, they can throw it at Kevin Durant. If they get into Western Conference Finals, there's going to be, a 2 minute stretch where the game's going to slow down. They're going to need to get stopped. So these are the kind of guys you add. Obviously, you can't predict stopping the Warriors, but I thought Bob Moute was probably one of the more underrated signings this offseason. Like you mentioned, Jack, he had a really good season from three. I don't know if he'll stay at that level, but the fact that he's going to Houston where they get a ton of open threes and he's going to be playing with two of the best playmakers in the NBA, it kind of bodes well for him. So I'm really looking forward to that. And like you said, Jay, PJ Tucker is probably one of the strongest dudes in the NBA, like especially at that wing position. That's why I think he's able to play a little bit down low just because he's so damn tough. Like he's not scared of anybody. And I think that's something, like you said, they'll need losing a Patrick Beverley, and getting him kind of makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And let me ask you guys this. Do you think, or I'll put it this way, how does the ranking of the Rockets change, if it does at all, if they were able to pull off the Melo sign and trade?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jay. I think it inches them up slightly, but you're likely in that trade to lose Ryan Anderson. I mean, not that you're giving up a whole lot. I mean, Ryan Anderson is the perfect sort of fall for what D'Antoni's system is all about. He's a liability on the defensive end, obviously, but not that Melo is, Mr. Luke Mute or PJ Tucker for that regard. But he gives them sort of some offensive versatility. But a lot has been made of the relationship between D'Antoni and Melo in the past. So wonder whether they've mended their fences, because at the end of the day, it was in Melo's control. He got to choose. He was the one that waived his no trade clause. And the fact that he chose to go to OKC says something. So I'm sure CP3 would have been in the ear of Daryl Morey, get my boy, get the hoodie down here in Houston. But I think it probably would be talking about them as much as OKC now, because it always helps to have those stars that you mentioned, Jay, that Daryl Morey loves to get. And 3 stars is better than 2. And right now OKC have 3. But as we've said before, Houston have some more depth, which I think ultimately puts them in better stead in my eyes.
Yeah, I think if they're only giving up Ryan Anderson and they didn't have to include a Gordon or an Ariza, then definitely that improves them. But they're never going to get to that number 1 spot. So, I mean, I think Melo would have definitely helped. And like I mentioned on the OKC pod, I think he's going to step up all around, and just having another player will help. But if they had to lose an Ariza or a Gordon, I think that would really have hurt them. So it's tough in the West because, like, you can't really get higher than the Warriors. Like, you could just solidify. Yeah, I already kind of have them as my second team. So it would just kind of just solidify them a little bit more if they added Melo. But sure. You mentioned the D'Antoni connection. Like, I think Melo was okay making that happen. I think the fact that he got traded to OKC is because he knew that the Knicks' new front office was not going to take a bad trade and take on the Ryan Anderson contract. I just think they told him, we're not going to do it. So there's no other move on the table.
No, I agree with that. I think that was, I think media day was like 48 hours away at that point. So they all, he's like, all right, we gotta do something, or it's gonna be this awkward moment where Melo comes out in the jersey for media day and he's still a Knick. So yeah, I think that was in everyone's interest for him to wave and go to OKC, which isn't a bad spot. I don't think he can get quality pizza there like he could in New York, but that's another pod for another day. Right?
It definitely is. Pizza's big talk, but let's talk departures. I mentioned Houston traded a lot of their team last year. Patrick Beverley, Sam Decker, Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams. They didn't trade him. They lost him in free agency. But these guys, who do you think they're going to miss the most other than Patrick Beverley? We know what he's going to bring, and he's that, junkyard dog. He's going to play that toughness and really annoy players like a Russell Westbrook. But out of the Sam Decker, Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams, tell me what they're going to miss from each guy a little bit.
Look, I think with Sam Decker, he's a young guy. We talked about him on the Clippers pod. He's got a decent amount of upside. He's got good energy, good cutter, good slasher. Isn't elite in any sort of area, but provides good energy, good hustle. Montrezl Harrell, nice sort of backup, nice sort of youth piece to Nene, to Capella. That they could have formed a nice sort of 1-2 young combo for at the 5 and the 4 and 5 position. And Lou Will is just buckets, nothing but buckets. But I think the loss of Lou Will, because Eric Gordon was already there, The acquisition of Lou Will was just going all out on that 43s, I think it was that we mentioned. So I don't think they lose much in any of these guys, but because the depth guys that they got in return were as good, if not better.
Yeah, I agree. I think we talked about Beverly's impact, and if nothing else, he's obviously a great player, but also just a fan favorite. And that's one of those guys when you kind of remember where you were when they traded that guy, right? Because he was just sort of embodying the city and the toughness and the grit of Houston. So just from a fan standpoint, people hate to see him go, but he's also a guy that gave a lot of cover to James Harden in the backcourt, right? You can play a lot of different ways because Beverly's taking the toughest backcourt assignment and letting Harden, take the lesser of the two evils when they have different matchups each night. I think Harold is interesting to me actually because I thought, he's a great athlete, just a long body that can get out and run, jump, and holler, with the best of them. And I think those are the kind of guys you need. I mean, I'm just closing my eyes and picturing the Paul Georges and the Kevin Durant's of the world, and it's just like if you can find those guys that are tough inside that can get out and run, and sort of finding that next Draymond in terms of physical traits and attributes. I think those people help you. So I think it's actually an underrated piece that they're going to miss. Sam Dekker, as I already said, just great shooter, a person that fits well in the system.
Yeah.
Buckets for days. I think that one, the only reason that one hurts, as Jack was saying, doesn't hurt as much is because they still have Eric Gordon. Of the two, I personally would probably take Lou Williams because I think he can give you some relief at the point guard spot too, a little bit better than Eric Gordon could. But ready to give you, instant offense off the bench. But having Gordon on the roster doesn't hurt his departure as much. Yeah, I mean, we've said it. You get Chris Paul, obviously, right, and that's a great pickup, and you got to make that trade 9 times out of 10. But they're just some glue guys, some guys that sort of made up the makeup of that team last year that won 55 games, that are gone, and that I think would be helpful in this title run this year. But so I guess time will tell to see if that was the right move. If you ask Morey about it, he will say absolutely because we got a star, and I think at the end of the day it's the right move as well. But you just had some guys, some chemistry guys, which is ironic because Morey, again's not a big chemistry dude. He's just like, hey, give me all the talent and we'll figure it out. Chemistry is a problem we can solve during the course of the season. So it'll be interesting to see because I think that team had something magical last year, man. I think they had something just kind of going on and, until they, sort of wet the bed against San Antonio. But up until that point, it was just something different about that team. And they had great locker room, great chemistry, and just to see some of those guys go, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out this season.
Yeah, they definitely have like a swag to them, like you said, the chemistry thing, and definitely losing them. I think one thing they did though well is add some other role players, like we mentioned, the Bahamute and the Tucker, to kind of fill in some of those roles. Obviously, it's not perfect, but Chris Paul is going to make up for a lot of areas where you're deficient. So I feel pretty good about what they did this offseason. Patrick Beverly, though, like you said, that definitely was a fan favorite, and the toughness that he brought, and just being that guy that you hate if you're 29 other teams, but if you're a Rockets fan, you definitely love him because he just goes out there and drives everybody nuts.
Yeah,
but let's talk starters. For me, it's pretty easy, but let's hear your take.
Yeah, I think it's easy, but you could easily, as we mentioned, at the wing position, Nick, easily sub in like a Ryan Anderson, sub out of Ryan Anderson for some of those guys. But you got CP3, you got James Harden, Trevor Ariza, Ryan Anderson's likely to start, at least at the start of the season, and then of course Clint Capella, who I think hint is in for a big season.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wouldn't change that roster or that starting lineup. Rather, I think that's the way to go. I think Clint Capella came into his own last year and just going to continue to have, has tremendous upside. I don't think he even realized how good he could be, going forward. I think it'll be interesting to see if they ever come out with just a different look with either Harden or Paul coming off the bench. I don't know if they necessarily start a game like that. I don't know why they would. But I'd be interested to see if they play with the backcourt a little bit and maybe, have uh, a Bamute come on, in place of Harden or in place of Paul, perhaps. Maybe have PJ Tucker in the lineup and go a little bigger. So I'm just curious, or Eric Gordon even. So I'm just curious if if D'Antoni plays with the matchups and has, Harden or Paul come off the bench. Like I say, I don't know why he would do that. But, just trying different things, different units, sort of a la Manu Ginobili. He doesn't start the game, but obviously he's in there crunch time. So I think he'll get creative, and I think you'll probably see more of that first part of the season. We're just filling each other out, just seeing what we have, what this roster can do, what combinations fit and what work. But at the end of the day, it'll be Harden and Paul on the floor. So I'm curious to see if D'Antoni comes out of his comfort zone a bit and mixes things up.
Yeah, I mean, I think at every point of the season, either Harden or CP3 will be on the floor, at least one of them. And I think he'll do a good job of, staggering their minutes a little bit. Also, I wouldn't be surprised if Chris Paul got like a little bit of a minutes reduction this year. He's starting to get up there in age. They want him fresh for the playoffs. Harden can do a lot of the heavy lifting. Like we said, they have some depth. But I think, what would be your death lineup? What would be the small ball lineup they could throw out there that would be the most interesting for you to watch?
Yeah, that death lineup you'd probably take out your Anderson and Capella and, literally sub them in for an Mbar Mute and a Tucker. If you want to go sort of ultra offensive, you might leave Anderson out there, play him at the 5, and have him Mbar Mute, but then you're obviously quite vulnerable around the rim. We've mentioned it countless times, but they've got a heap of versatility in terms of those matchups, in terms of those lineups that D'Antoni can put out. But as Jay's mentioned a few times, whether he can push himself out of his comfort zone now that he has the tools to be a bit more flexible, that's going to be the main question.
Yeah, I'd make those subs too. Tucker's your 5, maybe Ariza goes to the 4, and Babamute's in at 3, and then you have Harden and Paul. You could maybe flip it and go instant offense with the 3-guard lineup with Gordon, Howard, and Paul. Sort of a 3-guard, and then 2 out with Ariza and Tucker, or I don't know, Tariq Black, just for the heck of it. You can try different things, but yeah, I think there's just combinations. There's just ways to make this work, and just thinking about the lineup, I'm not convinced that Morey is not going to try to make some movement at the trade deadline. This is probably another talking point for us, but I think he really wants to see what he has, and I don't think he's given up on moving Ryan Anderson, quite frankly. And he's reading the tea leaves, and he's saying to himself, I think I'm going to play, being Daryl Morey here for a second. I think he still thinks he needs that third star, and I think he's still going to be working the phones. And by All-Star break, I think he tries to pull off one more trade to get the team ready to go up against Golden State in the Western Conference Finals.
Yeah, definitely. I think they definitely could be a team that would make a move, and they do have movable pieces. But like you guys said, any kind of combination of a Chris Paul, James Harden, and Eric Gordon, and Trevor Ariza, PJ Tucker, Bob Mute, I think any 5-man combination of those 6 guys is going to be really interesting, because they can I love when they'll be able to play like an Ariza, Tucker, and a Bob Mute at the same time, because in theory, if the other team is playing small, they could switch on 3 through 5 or 2 through 5. So that could be really big, and that always helps defensively in the NBA with the amount of pick and rolls.
Sure.
But breakout starter, who's breaking out in the starting lineup?
I'm giving it to Clint Capella. This young big had a nice season last year, but he's poised for it in huge season this year. He had a mini breakout year, putting up 12.6 points, 8.1 rebounds, 1.2 blocks, just a bit over 64% from the field, and a very respectable PER of 21.4. I'd expect those numbers to go to, maybe even a double-double, maybe average a double-double throughout the season. And, Paul has great relationships with his centers, as, he got DeAndre to flourish out there in Lob City. So, I think Lob City could be heading down to Houston soon with Clint Capella, because he's certainly got all the tools to improve his game, maybe even be a 70% shooter from the field.
I like Capella, and that's probably the leader in the clubhouse for me as well. But I'm also curious, excited about Trevor Ariza this year. I think he's what, 31 now, 32. So he's, backside, back nine of the prime, but still a really good defender, great shooter, uh, very versatile player. I think with the addition of Paul, he sort of moves to the de facto third option, obviously, or maybe even fourth option, depending on the matchups and what have you. And I think you could start to see, sort of a Trevor Ariza turn back the clock and sort of Trevor Ariza, Laker championship days, right? Where he's there, he's a contributor, and you're on a team with Kobe Bryant and Ron Artest, or Meta World Peace, excuse me. He's able to knock down shots, take some big defensive assignments. I don't know if he's going to have this sort of, all-star year with these killer numbers, but I think his game is just going to, I think it's going to be a little bit easier for him with the addition of the talent on the court. And I think you're going to see a guy who's sort of a Scottie Pippen, like say early Laker Trevor Ariza glue guy that's doing a little bit of everything. Maybe even moments where he's sort of out front, in the backcourt, sort of directing traffic on the offensive end with Paul and Harden on the bench, in spot minutes. I think Ariza, with the new role on this team, could turn back the clock a little bit.
Yeah, I like almost all their starters, for to have a good season. I think them, Ryan Anderson, Trevor Ariza, Clint Capella, they all should have good years just for the amount of attention that a Chris Paul and a James Harden are going to get offensively. They're going to get so much attention. They both create well for their teammates. They both make their teammates better. But I'm going to go with Capella. I think what did he tweeted out when they got Chris Paul, more lobs.
Yep.
He's going to be catching lobs all over the place. He already caught a lot from Harden. Like you said, Jack, DeAndre, Blake Griffin caught plenty from Chris Paul. So I think Capella could have a really big season. And I think they kind of need him to step up. They need to have at least one, really good big man, and just in case they match up with a team not named Golden State in the playoffs.
Right. I mean, and Capella will get the lobs, but he must also remember that Chris Paul will yell at him. So
yeah,
should call DeAndre before October 17th just to get a taste of what that is like. But anyways.
Yeah, honestly, what do you think? We didn't really talk on it that much. Let's talk relationships. How do you think James Harden and Chris Paul are going to fit? Obviously, we mentioned we were surprised about the trade. I think a lot of people, said that James Harden and Chris Paul are a lot better friends than we originally thought, and that had a lot to do with this trade. How do you think that's going to work on the court, off the court? How do you think this all works out with these two superstars?
Look, I think it's going to be fine. Chris Paul had the freedom, being a free agent, to choose where he wanted to go. So he could have gone to San Antonio, as we mentioned. He could have gone to Cleveland to join his buddy LeBron and the Banana Boat crew. But he chose to head out to Houston because, he wants to win. Chris Paul hasn't had that playoff success yet. And that's, I think, the number one driving force between his choice to head out to Houston and join James Harden. James Harden is elite on the court. I think on the court they're going to have great chemistry. Off the court there could be some issues, but I think James Harden, I think will be a nice sort of balance. We talked about Nick mentioned the two bigs out there in New Orleans, the fire and ice dudes, two opposites, but they're going to be having a big season. But I think the relationship, the yin to yang, the yang, whatever comparison, the peanut butter to the jelly, they're going to have. I like it. But, there's certainly, whenever Chris Paul is at any team, there's bound to be some volatility. But I think he can elevate James Harden in terms of competitiveness. There's times where he might seem a bit, lackadaisical to an extent, something Russell Westbrook was never last year. So I think he can maybe bring out a little bit of a hard-nosed edge that we might not have seen from James Harden.
Yeah, I think I think it'll work for the most part. I think there'll be some interesting moments, just because I think it's a slight different generation. I mean, Chris Paul is kind of pre-social media. I mean, he still uses the technology and what have you, right? And James Harden is a quintessential, quote unquote, new dude, right? He's got the skinny jeans and the weird jackets, a la Westbrook, and just these new guys, right, that are out, making, dummy accounts and following themselves and making those comments, like a whole, not without naming people in general, but that's what the new dudes do, right? And Chris Paul is kind of this, not quite a throwback, but sort of that Kobe generation and that Kobe mold, right? I think he and Kobe like are in the philosophy that sort of this um, contention and this conflict, breeds success, right? They're both in each other's face, and this is how you do it. This is how you make a team tough and win and toughness, right? So, I mean, I think for the most part, the relationship will be fine, but I think there will be times when it's middle of January and they're on a 3-game losing streak, and Harden slips back into sort of turnstile defense, and Chris Paul, who's known to point and get in guys' faces. There could be some of that, but I think that's more of that's just Chris Paul's style, and less of sort of these guys are no longer friends or they hate playing with each other. I think that's just how Chris Paul deals with that sort of adversity, and I think Harden just kind of walks off the court and subtweets or whatever, and that's I think it's more generational than it's a real true conflict that could be brewing during the season. So.
Do you think that could actually help James Harden, push into another level, having someone like Chris Paul kind of get after him when he doesn't step up?
Yeah, I think I mentioned. Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
think. Yeah, sorry, Jay. I really think it can. The players always have. They get comfortable. It took Scotty joining the Bulls to elevate MJ to the GOAT status that we know him as now. It took LeBron joining Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. Sometimes you need that other guy. Dwight Howard couldn't bring it out of him, obviously, as we mentioned earlier in the pod. But I think someone like a Chris Paul is going to demand high standards from a James Harden. I don't think he's going to be a defensive turnstile this year. I think James Harden, a lot of defense, especially for the guards, on ball defense, is all about effort. And because James Harden just doesn't want to, I think Chris Paul, if he sees that from Harden, it's a trickle down effect. You set the standard. You guys are the leaders of the team. You don't want to set that standard for anyone else on the side. So I've mentioned that I think he can bring a new sort of hard-nosed edge, a bit more of a competitive side out to him, and I completely agree with that.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that it helps that it's a player of Paul's stature coming at him, right? Because for all that was made of Russell Westbrook and sort of Russell and the Westbrooks last year, right, for OKC, right? That was the team. Harden had some help, but not a ton much more, right? Just in terms of the talent. I think a big reason for their success last year was the right pieces in the right places. And the Rockets just weren't, just overwhelming you with talent. And I think had this trade not been made for someone like Chris Paul or someone of his caliber, you could run into a situation where, Harden looks around, he says, look, I'm the best player on the team and these things are happening and you guys, everyone not named James Harden need to get it together. Not, without knowing anything about James Harden as a person or a player. I mean, that's almost human nature for that to be the response, right? But to have someone like Chris Paul and his personality, to call Harden out when he needs to be called out, and also have the gravitas and the pedigree to say, look, man, we need to get this together. Let's pick it up. Let's be leaders on this team. Let's lead by example. I think that helps to have a player of that stature, of Paul's stature, rather, to send that message to James Harden. And we talked about, the theme of the pod has been James Harden and his evolution and the next step that he takes on the ladder. And I think part of that is being accountable. And it helps to have guys that are, either veterans in the locker room that you respect, the OGs that have been doing it longer than you have, or, guys that are on par or quite frankly better than you, that can speak out and give you that sort of tough pill to swallow at times when you aren't performing at your best or not leading the team as you probably should be leading it. So
I 100% agree. I think the fact that Chris Paul arguably is one of the greatest point guards of all time, that's going to help Harden so much. And I think both these guys kind of realize, like, the other one's going to make my life a lot easier. We're going to make life easier for each other. Let's, make this thing work. But moving on real quick, no explanation needed. Who's your breakout bench player?
Luka Mbamute.
Who's my guy? I'm going to go with, gosh, I can't say his name either.
Dude, it's a struggle.
Kyo?
Juqui.
Man, I was way off. I think, you know what? I think I'm pulling it. I'm going with that. No explanation needed. We said no explanation. I'm not going to explain it. Boom. That's my breakout player.
I tried to look up his name to pronounce it on the pod, and like 4 different websites had different pronunciations. So I was just, I was like, yeah, I don't know what to do here. Like, I'm gonna try, but I don't know. I'm gonna go with the easy pick. I'm gonna go with Eric Gordon.
Oh,
I think
gosh.
I think the fact he's gonna play with Chris Paul, James Harden, like he's gonna have life so easy. It's just gonna be plenty of open threes, open shots. He had a great year last year, and I think another big season for him. But I didn't even need to give explanation, but whatever. Wins. Let's talk wins. Best case scenario win-wise and best case scenario playoff-wise.
I'm going to give them, I'm going to give them a ceiling of a 60-win team. They could even get, maybe even as high as 62 wins. The Spurs got there last year, so there's no saying that if we're talking that this is the second best team in the West, that they can't get there either. They've got to make the Western Conference Finals. It'd be a missed season, a losing season, a disappointing season if they can't, get to the big dance where they will ultimately face the Warriors.
Well, in a best case scenario, can they beat the Warriors and get to the finals?
No. Just come on. Like the Rocket would have to literally fall onto Oakland and the Bay Area and wipe out half of that organization.
Well, so much for an interesting topic, but
yeah. Well, very topical. But just going with the whole Rocket theme, so to speak. But like, let's be real, guys. Like, no, it's just simple as that. No.
Wow, man, that took all the air out of my balloon. Because I was going to say, so I'd say 61 wins. I'm going to say something a little controversial in basketball circles that I think the Western Conference obviously is better than the Eastern Conference, but I also think it's top heavy. And so by that, I mean, I think there are wins to be had throughout the Western Conference for teams other than, quite frankly, Golden State and, San Antonio, assuming they put it together. But otherwise, I mean, I think the Rockets are better than the Nuggets, who look great so far. I think they're better than the Timberwolves. It'll just take 1 week of 4-hour practices with Tom Thibodeau, and, the legs will be shot for the Timberwolves. And I think they're better than New Orleans, et cetera, so on and so forth. So I think 60 wins is attainable. I am going to be the optimist here and say you don't need a whole rocket to fall in the Bay Area. You just need 1 weak Steph Curry ankle twist or 1 Kevin Durant ankle twist, 1 Draymond Green punch kick chop to the man region of someone else. And these things literally turn on a dime. So best case scenario, keyword being best, is the NBA Finals. I think if I had to say, not wishing any ill will or harm on anyone on the Warriors, but if I were the Rockets, I would rather say, maybe I'll put this to you guys, because my thought is if the Warriors, if I had a choice of who had to go down, who's hurt, I would rather it be Steph out of the series than KD. Because if nothing else, I think, and this is all psychobabble, and I have no way of knowing this objectively, but I feel like I've seen what Kevin Durant can do when it's his team or what have you. Like, I'd rather have Steph, in a brace or what have you than Kevin Durant. That's just me.
Well, I think Steph's the engine to the offense a little bit of what they try to do, and his ability to attract so many people, off ball. And I think in terms of, I love Sean Livingston. He's one of my favorite players ever. But the drop off, what they're going to get at the point guard position, I think they could probably make up for Kevin Durant scoring a little bit. What do you guys think about losing a Draymond Green?
Look, I think because KD's defense skyrocketed last year, and I like, the addition of a Jordan Bell. He's still obviously only a rookie, but Draymond, it's an interesting point that you make. But in terms of the playmaking, you get a lift from Steph in that department. In terms of the defense, you get a lift from, say, a KD, an Iguodala. We're talking some serious hypothetical here, boys, but who knows? It could happen. And I mean, it sort of did happen last year when KD got injured towards the end of last season, and they swept the Portland Trailblazers. So
Right. Right.
they're just so good. Like, they're just too freaking good.
I mean, I actually agree with Jay. I think best case scenario, somebody goes down on Golden State. I think the Rockets have enough that they could beat them. But, knock on wood, I don't want anyone to get injured on Golden State. And I think win-wise, they could grab like 62. I think this team is stacked. And you saw already in preseason, they have a lot of depth too. So I think they're going to be able to rest guys and maybe try out some of these young guys, like the dude's name I can't pronounce. So I'm pretty excited. I'm really high on the Rockets if you couldn't tell already. So I'm super pumped for the season. But worst thing that can happen to the Rockets this year.
Yeah, we mentioned the sort of CP3 and Harden relationship that kind of goes sour, a la Howard and Harden. The team implodes like a lot of these super teams. They're still going to make the postseason, but they could somehow, finish outside that coveted top four. The Timberwolves could gel a bit better. Denver could gel. OK3, OKC could have some nice chemistry there. But I think, as we mentioned sort of earlier in the pod, the basement for this Houston Rockets team isn't that low. We said like a 6 out of the NBA. I can't see them being that low, even in a stacked West.
Yeah, I agree. I think and everything you said, Jake. I mean, those are the teams that sort of running through my head. I think for a worst case for the Western Conferences, Golden State's Golden State, and for all the trash I talked about Pop and the Spurs 30 minutes ago, that they do the Spurs thing and second in the West. Let's say OK3 is third. Let's say Minnesota puts it all together and Cat's a monster, and you got Jimmy Butler and et cetera, et cetera. And then let's slide. Let's say they're battling Denver for back and forth between the 5th and 6th seed, and I don't know, maybe New Orleans puts it together. So absolute worst case is, I think, 6th seed in the West, 5th, 6th in the West. They get out of that coveted top 4, as you said, Jack, and they're fighting a surging Denver team, at that spot, and maybe a revamped Portland, healthy Portland squads nipping at their heels at the 7th spot or 6th spot. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that's extraordinary leaps, and things would have to go. The ball would have to bounce the way of those other teams that I mentioned for them to be out of the top. I'd say out of the top 4, because I think OKC with the addition of Melo, I think changes the board a little bit. I have San Antonio behind all 3 of those teams: Golden State, OKC, and Houston. But I'm an avowed Spurs hater, as indicated on my discussion on the pod earlier. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think, it'd be almost hard for them to fall out of the top 4. And, they did have a lot of talent in the West, but this team did so well last year, and they only had James Harden. They didn't have Chris Paul. So bearing, any huge injury, I think they're in pretty good shape. But realistically, what's going to happen next year for Houston? Win-wise, playoff-wise, where does it all end? Or does it?
Well, according to Jack, it's short of nuclear war, then it is.
It's already decided.
It's already decided. I think realistically, to Jack's point earlier, I think they're thinking Western Conference Final. I think something they'll never say at a press conference is, let's just get to a 7-game series, and see what happens. Right? Let's get there and see what happens with the Warriors, and then we'll give them our best shot. So I think realistically, I think you're thinking second in the West. 60-win season, Western Conference Finals, duking it out with the Warriors for a right to go to the finals.
Yeah,
honestly, go ahead, Jack.
Sorry, mate. I'm going to give them a respectable sort of 58 wins. I think that's likely to give them the 2nd seed. They had 55 last year. CP3 and the addition sort of gives them an extra couple. But I think it's finally going to be some playoff success for CP3, which he solely deserves.
Yeah, I think it's the Western Conference Finals is what they're aiming for. And like you said, Jay, I think they want that 7-game series, and you never know what happens if you get there. And that's probably their goal. And I'll make the heavy prediction. I think I'm pretty confident that's what the Western Conference Finals is going to look like. I think it's going to be Golden State and Houston, and then obviously the Warriors are going to advance. The real bold prediction. But
put it on the line.
Hot takes over here, scorching. But let's talk the truth. And I'm going to let you guys go first on the truth today.
Wow. It's an honor, Nick. An absolute honor. Look, I've got a couple. I've been known
A couple
chuck
out.
I've been known to chuck out a few myself, but I'm going to go with the basketball emoji. Now we know about the questions about whether the two ball dominant guards are going to be able to share it. Are they going to be able to share the ball? They've got high usage rates. But Houston Rockets are also a basketball team, so there's a double-edged meaning there. Plus, I've also got the emoji with the two fingers in the air. So not necessarily the peace symbol, but I'm more thinking that it comes down to the two guys. And I also think that they're going to be number 2 in the West. So double emoji, kind of triple meaning there as well. So I go all out with these ones, Nick. I challenge you to up that, to best that.
Great. Jay, all you right now.
I don't know if I can follow that, man. I should have gone first. So I had a basketball emoji as well, and I have, I think, what is commonly known as the 2 arms up with the person, sort of the praise yay hands, like woo. That actually is going to represent the Rockets setting an NBA record for threes made this season. I think they're going to go balls to the wall, nuts from three-point line. And this is just going to be the referee and the Rockets fans, known locally as the Red Rowdies. Shout out to the Rowdies, with their arms up after the Rockets just rain a season's worth of 3-point buckets for the 2017-2018 season.
Yeah, honestly, that does fit perfectly. I think they're going to score a ton of threes. They're just going to light it up offensively. And Jack really came from my head this episode, and I didn't even have a good emoji prepared. So I don't even know if I should announce it or what.
You can't not, mate. You can't not. You are the king of it.
I mean, I'll be honest. This is the one episode I didn't come prepared. I usually am really on point about my emojis, but I'm just going to go. You guys pick the basic ones too that I could always win with, the basketball or the rocket. But that would have been the easiest ones for me to go to. I want the emoji that I'm trying to find that I don't think exists is a 2-headed monster for Chris Paul and James Harden. But lack of emojis, they need to step up a little bit. Maybe we should talk Bitmojis next year.
iOS update, I think, is happening very soon. So we can. I reckon, Nick, you'll be the resident OTG guy that's got to, because we need to somehow insert some Bitmojis, some emojis. I reckon every OTG writer needs to get their own Bitmoji. I've got mine, but I'm not going to share it just yet.
Well, yeah, we definitely could do something like that, or somebody could write an article all on emojis. But the only other one I could think of is I think it's a asteroid or some type of something flying from space coming off of a rocket, because they're going to make a splash, like Jay said, offensively, and just terrorize the league. And it's just going to be scoring, ball movement, shooting all over the place. But let's talk.
Or like Jack said, that's what they would need to beat the Warriors for that.
Maybe
the Bay Area.
The world has been a crazy place, but I don't think that's going to happen. Let's talk League Pass. Give me your League Pass rating for the Rockets this year.
I'm gonna give them. We're down to the big teams now, so we're not getting any lower than an 8, 9, even a 10. I'm giving them an 8.5. They're one of my top 3 or 4 teams to watch this season. I'll certainly be watching plenty of Rockets games, that's for sure.
Yeah, I got them at a 9. I mean, I want to see how this thing gels. I kind of want to be there from the beginning. I went to undergrad and law school in Houston, so I followed the Rockets when I was there, and now I'm way, way out in the Pacific Northwest. So I got to see my Rockets, so a little personal plug there. But yeah, I just want to see how this team develops and how they, sort of come about, and if they really have a shot against the Warriors. I think that'll be evident over the course of the season. So, all due respect to, the Lakers and 76ers of the world, those will be interesting teams with their own storylines. But I want to see how this Rocket team gels. So they're definitely up there for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think every NBA fan will just be happy if they can see a 7-game series against the Warriors at some point in the postseason. And I think the Rockets might be the number one choice. Honestly, the Rockets have me contemplating if I should break my skewed scale, because I super want to watch this team, but I'm going to give them an 8 out of 10. but I'll probably watch. There'll be one of my most watched Western Conference teams for sure. And FanDuel wise, I definitely have a lot of plays. But let's talk. Joey's got to throw that in there, especially with all these role guys. You get a guy like Eric Gordon, he might pop off for you. But let's talk. Let's talk. The rest of League Pass. You would watch the Rockets over what TV show that you like?
Look, we got the big ones now. I'd made an enemy out of Nick after calling out Rick and Morty in our last OKC pod. So this time, I'm going to go with. Oh, look, I hate to bring it up again, but I'm going with Friends. Now this is probably my
love Friends.
Fourth. I'm gonna have no friends after these. It's probably my third or fourth most watched show ever. I'm currently, revisiting again with my girlfriend on a nightly basis, to rewatch it with her. Still frequently cracks me up. Shout outs to Ross, Chandler, Phoebe. They've got a solid unit out there out in the Central Perk. So. I don't know. I pondered the question to you guys. We are an NBA pod, but how would you guys rank the Friends characters in terms of your favorites?
Oh, I ride for Jennifer Aniston. My wife knows. If Jennifer Aniston, not even if Jennifer Aniston said "leave your family," she said "murder your family." I'd be like, you know what? It's worth it. No, just in case. Disclaimer on the pod: that is a joke. Just in case my family unfortunately turns up missing, I had nothing to do with it. I ride pretty hard for Rachel. Then I can do this easy. I'm off Friends all the way, man. Rachel, Chandler, Joey, Phoebes, Monica, and Ross.
Ooh, yeah, that's fair.
Like you said, Jack, I might lose some friends because I'm not a big Friends guy. I couldn't even.
What are you doing?
No. I've only watched it with my girlfriend. I've never watched the episode by myself, so I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to sit this one out.
No new friends.
Oh man, that was a real.
But Jay, what about you?
You're the Gunther of the pod now. You're like Nick's like, I wish I knew who that was. No, weren't you guys talking Game of Thrones the other day? I felt like I heard a pod about a Game of Thrones or maybe an article I read, and I was thinking. I don't watch Game of Thrones. I'm coming clean. I don't watch that show. So
well, we mentioned it on the OKC pod. Steven Adams.
That's what it was. The OKC
cameo.
Yeah, that's what it was. I had that in my head. Sorry, that was a sidebar, and we'll just skip over the fact that I said I don't watch that, so I don't get shamed and walk down the town square naked while people throw tomatoes at me.
What's your Twitter handle again?
So show reveal our Twitter handles on the
show. So show I would pass up for a Rockets game. Like I said, I got my lady friend and we watched This Is Us. So I got to make time for that. Really, really sentimental show. I love me some Rick and Morty, so I got to watch that too. I think, and Atlanta's not on TV yet, but once it comes back on, that's prime viewing for me as well. So
yes,
I think I'll have to unfortunately kick Blackish off the roll there. I think it's a really funny show. I like it, but I'll have to DVR it for a Rockets game.
Yeah, that's at least yeah, that's a good choice. Blackish is definitely a good show if you want to laugh. For me, this is tough. Like at this point, I'm running out of shows, and I have a few shows that I've already committed to not using. So I'll let you guys know about that now. Rick and Morty, I'll never use that. Dragon Ball Z, I'll never use that. And I'll never use X-Files. Random fact. That's one of my favorite shows. But
that is random.
Yeah. And it's I randomly got into X-Files, a little sidebar too. Like I just picked it up one day. I was like, you know what? I'll watch this. There's about 10 seasons. I'll get sucked in. Next thing I know, I'm a big X-Files guy. But for me, I'm also a big Marvel guy. So I'm going to go with, that Defender series and, including all of them like Luke Cage, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist. I think I'll watch the Rockets over them, but those are good shows, especially if you like the comics.
Do you know what? Funny story. I kid you not. I had this conversation with my wife. My wife's a big Marvel person as well. She saw the Defender show that was coming out. She started with Supergirl, then started watching Jessica Jones, all these shows you just named. And the Defenders came out. In preparation of the Defenders premiering, she watched all the episodes of all those shows you just named. And we were just binging. And I was like, where are our children? Yeah. I was like, what is going on? And then I asked her one day in bed, I was like, well, if you had just cut out a show, like, because I noticed, like, besides sports, I watch like 4 things. It's like Blackish, Rick and Morty. This is like, it's 5 shows, like that I watch. So I was like, if you could cut out one, what show, if you had to watch one that you have to keep and everything else you have to cut out. And so she does this whole Nick, sort of like you, Jedi mind trick. She's like, well, are we talking just the Marvel shows, like one particular show, or like the whole catalog? I was like, that's like 9 shows. That's like, pick a show. She's like, because I would pick Marvel, but that means Iron Fist and Luke Cage. They're like, no, that's like 9 shows. You got to pick one of those 9 that you would want to keep, and the rest you got to throw out. So the binging is real with Marvel in my house. So I definitely, as someone married to a person like that, then I definitely I get it. I get the Marvel universe being very important in your household.
And you made a good choice, Jay. If she likes Marvel, she knows what she's doing.
Binge watch it. I don't think my kids had lunch for school for like a week. It was pretty sad.
But that wraps it up for today. Jay, great having you on for the first time. Jack, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and have a great night.
Blast off, everyone.
Take it easy, guys.